Thank you, Rabbi. As you put it, we go back a long way, but whenever one reminisces about the 60s, I remember the aphorism about the 60s that if you remember it, you really weren't there. So I'm always hesitant about those remembrances, but those were formative periods in my life. I was at the time in the 60s actually a vice president of McGill Hill. Also, Hillel was very much a part of my life, and I'm delighted to be at a conference that is co-sponsored by BU Hillel and by Camera, and which really brings us together in common cause, what I would call the universality of the common cause, if I can put it that way. The struggle against hate, against injustice, against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide, and against what has become the code word and the organizing idiom for this conference, delegitimization. But all of this as part of the larger struggle for peace and human rights and human dignity, as the students inspired us with their remarks yesterday evening. And I salute the students who are the foot soldiers in this struggle for showing us the way with their own courage, resilience, and dedication. The basic thesis of my remarks today, simply put, is that if war is the continuation of politics by other means, as Clausewitz put it, then lawfare is the waging of war, the war of delegitimization under the cover of law. Indeed, globalization, war by other means, is, as I mentioned, the organizing theme of this conference. But it has become the buzzword, the code word that underpins a host of conferences here and beyond, and indeed has become part of everyday discourse, reflecting and representing the animus that really haunts us all in a very profound way. But I want to suggest to you that delegitimization is not a new phenomenon. It is a new conference phenomenon, but it is not in and of itself a new phenomenon. It has been with us since the birth of the State of Israel, with the characterization, if you recall, at the time of Israel as an original sin. It was the precursor to the Six-Day War, when Israel was spoken of, and we have forgotten these words, as a congenital act of aggression. The false accusation in the mirror, as it is called, where you accuse others of that which you yourself are seeking to perpetrate and exercise, namely aggression. And it found institutional and juridical expression in the Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975. Indeed, we meet today at an important, almost I would say, historical moment of remembrance and reminder. We meet on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the Zionism is Racism resolution, which the late U.S. Senator Daniel Moynihan, in a succinct definition of lawfare at the time, though the word had yet to be used, referred to the Zionism as Racism resolution as giving the abomination of anti-Semitism international juridical sanction under the cover of the United Nations. And so we had then, if you will, the birth of delegitimization under the cover of law. Or I would put it in another way, because it's not just delegitimization under the cover of law, it is a much more sophisticated approach, and that is the laundering of delegitimization under the cover of law. And I say this because this brings me to reference another revolution that was beginning at the time, and both converge, and that is really the theme of my remarks, because they converge under lawfare, and that is 1975 was also the advent, if you will, the birth of the international human rights revolution. It was the eve then of the birth of the International Bill of Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic Rights. It was also 1975, if you remember, the birth of the Helsinki Final Act, which formed such an organizing idiom with respect to our struggle for Soviet Jewry and our use of human rights and the rule of law in that struggle. That were really the legal instruments, the spear carriers for Alan and myself and others involved in the struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I recall the statement made shortly thereafter by Father Robert Drinan here in Boston, who wrote the book on the history and hopes of the human rights revolution, and who played such an important role in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, when he said at the time, speaking of the human rights revolution, that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm is the most revolutionary development in contemporary jurisprudence. And so we had at one and the same time almost two parallel universes developing, converging to bring about delegitimization, but at the time, two parallel universes. As a Canadian, as a law professor, I was living through both those universes at the same time. As a Canadian, giving the mantra that one hears in Canada and even that I use as a law professor, the United Nations is seen as an organizing idiom of our foreign policy. International law is a centerpiece of our identity. Human rights is part of our DNA. And yet at the same time as I was teaching this, internalizing this, living this, I also began to become witness to the parallel development of lawfare, which in fact was beginning to invoke and utilize and anchor itself in the human rights revolution. So while we were involved, rightly so, in the use of human rights in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, human rights, the rule of law, legal institutions, and like were beginning to be mobilized for lawfare. Let me give you a snapshot of many that I can give that was going on at the same time as the Zionism is racism resolution of the United States, but it was passing under the radar screen. But the convergence of the two revolutions finds expressions in this. There were at that time the meetings of all the various United Nations specialized agencies, the ILO, WHO, etc. And so it was then that Israel was held to be the enemy of labor. Evidence, and I'm going back now over 35 years, evidence the resolution of the International Labor Organization condemning Israeli suppression of trade unionism. The enemy of health, evidence the resolution of the United Nations World Health Organization condemning, among other things, Israeli poisoning of Palestinians on the West Bank. The enemy of culture, evidence the resolution of UNESCO condemning alleged Israeli desecration of holy sites in Jerusalem and beyond. The enemy of women, evidence the resolution of the United Nations Status of Commission on Women with respect to Israeli oppression of women. The enemy of peace, evidence the resolution of the UN General Assembly that Israel was not a peace-loving nation. And through it all, the enemy of human rights. Evidence the resolutions of the United Nations Human Rights Commission referring to Israel then and since as a human rights violator. And so what you had at the time is the convergence of these two revolutions, but where the legitimate revolution in human rights, of which Father Robert Drinan spoke and used and invoked for the purposes of Soviet Jewry, was beginning to be hijacked and to underpin the lawfare and the delegitimization of Israel under law. And so it was then that Israel held out to be the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, human rights. Israel held out to be the enemy of all that is good, was therefore the repository of all that is evil. The emergence, therefore, of Israel as the poisoner of the international wells, and by decree of United Nations law and institutions. And so I wrote at the time, and all of this was really the forerunner of what became much more insidious references to Israel as an apartheid Nazi state. But as I wrote at the time, some 35 years ago, that in a world in which human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, and I was one of those who celebrated it, and in its authentic sense, still would celebrate it. the portrayal of Israel as the meta-human rights violator of our time has Israel emerge as the new Antichrist of our time.